Good morning, everyone here at CamEd Business School and everyone who will be seeing us online. So today, again, as always, we have a great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Pettis. He's a great expert, worldwide known as the one you go to when you have questions about world economic growth and in particular, economic growth in China. So, Professor, again, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
So far, so good. Your visit to Cambodia, how is it?
Great. It's really beautiful. I had a chance to go to Siem Reap, which is, of course, spectacular.
Good.
But it's been a very good time.
Great. Wonderful to hear that. So, right away, now, you know that everybody keeps asking, right? Yes, we all know how big China is, how big Chinese economy is, and we being not too far away from China, of course, we absorb all the news, all that. But as your many books have described, yes, China economic model has succeeded to one point, and then now they start to have some issues around it. So could you please quickly take us through what kind of issues are we talking about and how might those relate to us?
The problems facing the Chinese economy are the ones that have faced every economy that's run this growth model. It's a fairly well-known and successful growth model. It's what we call an investment-driven model.
Right.
So what ends up happening in this case is that the country implements policies that raise the savings rate, which is the same thing as lowers the consumption rate, and channels those savings into the banking system and then through the banking system into very high levels of investment. When your economy is significantly underinvested, this is a great model. It generates enormous amounts of growth. The problem that's faced every single country that's faced this model, that's implemented this model, is that when you have a very high investment growth rate, at some point you run out of ability to absorb more investment productively. And then when that happens, you have to bring investment growth down. But because GDP growth is mostly investment growth and consumption growth, if you bring investment growth down, you bring GDP growth down, unless you can raise consumption growth.
Right.
And that's the difficult part. Once you structure the economy to suppress consumption in order to generate savings, then when you try to restructure the economy to unleash consumption, it's very difficult for the economy to adjust.
Great. I think, okay, now let's unpack a little bit. Of course, you're talking about if your economic model is growth driven, you want to keep it going up so that people keep happy, right? Because then you say, oh, growth is going up, so therefore we are doing good. But then at the same time, you also mentioned it cannot go up and up forever. At one point, you would have to balance out between savings and growth and surplus and all that. So could you maybe give us another example as to how China economic model has served its people for a while, and now people are worrying about the fact that they might save a lot, but they don't consume enough. And why is that the case? Why is it at one point, not particularly to China, that most people start to worry instead of spending, they just keep saving up. And if they keep saving and if they don't spend, like you said, then it's not good for the economy, because when you and I stop going to restaurants, people lose job, right? And for those who lose job, of course they cannot save. So,
yeah, that's the classic problem that Keynes described in the 1920s and 1930s, and that is that in a world in which you have huge investment needs, which was most of the world in the 19th century, for example, and many developing countries today, there is a potential benefit of suppressing consumption. And that is that you unleash savings, which if it goes into productive investment, generates even more growth. And so you can grow quite quickly. The problem is that when you no longer have this unlimited demand for investment, then, as you mentioned, policies that reduce consumption reduce jobs, because if we don't consume, other people can't work, et cetera, et cetera. And so you get caught in a kind of Keynesian demand trap. And that's a problem that China is currently facing. So the big debate in China is, what do you do, and what is the impact on the rest of the world?
Right.
Well, what China needs to do is to boost domestic consumption. But we've been talking about this for years. It's very difficult to do. The alternative, and why this matters to Cambodia and countries around the world, is that if you produce more than you consume and you invest, you must export the balance. And so as China's been bringing investment down, because there's too much investment, without bringing consumption up, their trade surplus is growing. And the rest of the world has to absorb that trade surplus.
And now comes the tricky part. How do you know, what to do to ensure that the rest of the world will absorb Chinese surplus? There's no guarantee, right?
Right. And in fact, the rest of the world doesn't want to. Because everybody has the same problem. Everybody wants more jobs and more domestic production. And they want to use their demand to boost domestic production. But an increasing part of their demand is going to boost Chinese production. And that's why you're seeing trade conflicts rise around the world. And it's not just China.
Right.
South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, the Netherlands, many countries have weak domestic demand. And so they're taking up more and more global demand to serve their domestic needs. And the result of that, as I discuss in my 2013 book, which you mentioned before, is the increasing likelihood of trade conflict.
Right.
And as that happens, then it becomes very difficult for the surplus countries. So we're in the middle of that conflict.
Right. For most economists, if you could share, why is it so hard to boost local consumption? Why is it so hard for policymakers to tell people, you know, you better not save too much, please consume. But you said it's not easy to convince people to boost local consumption. So is there any way around it?
Well, the problem is that there are two reasons why savings are high. One reason is because a big share of the economy doesn't go to households, but it goes to business and government. So in the US, for example, 80% of GDP goes to households. In China, it's closer to 60%.
Right.
And because it's households that consume, if you reduce the share that goes to households, you reduce consumption, and so you increase savings. The other reason for high savings in China is because Chinese households are very worried about the economy. For many years, the economy just went up and up and up, and housing prices went up and everything went up. And then suddenly in the last 3 years, that's changed dramatically. Unemployment among young people is above 20%.
Wow.
People are losing jobs. People are getting their salaries cut. For example, bankers all had their salaries seriously reduced in the last 3 years.
Right.
So what happens in a case like that? You are not sure you can keep your job. And even if you keep your job, you're afraid they may lower your salary.
Right.
So what should you do now? You should spend less and save more in case the bad things happen. So until you fix the economy, you can't get people to spend more. And until you get people to spend more, it's hard to fix the economy. So they're in a trap.
Right. Okay. I know that for standard, non-economist people, usually we tend to think surplus is always good, deficit is always bad. But it's not true, is it?
No. Historically, countries have grown very rapidly running deficits, most famously the United States in the 19th century, or they've grown very rapidly running surpluses, most famously Japan in the last 30 to 40 years. What really matters is the structure of those surpluses and deficits. And so it's one of the discussions that you and I have had with some policymakers here in Cambodia. There's nothing wrong with Cambodia running deficits. What matters is whether those deficits are funding investment,
right,
in which case Cambodia is growing more quickly than its foreign borrowing,
right,
or funding consumption, in which case Cambodia isn't. In the latter case, debt rises very quickly, and so you run into problems with the economy. In the former case, debt rises, but the economy rises even more quickly, so you're richer. So the real issue for Cambodia has to be how much investment do they want? How much can they fund domestically out of domestic savings? And then the rest must be funded by foreign savings, which means Cambodia must run a deficit.
Right, and as you are perfectly aware, the issue facing Sri Lanka at the moment, could you explain that a little bit and how it might relate to us here?
Yeah, Sri Lanka made a very classic developing country mistake in the sense that much of its debt was borrowed in a foreign currency. And the problem with foreign currency debt is that it reinforces both good things and bad things. When things are good, borrowing foreign money is better for your economy because you can borrow it more cheaply. And as the good economy causes your currency to rise, the cost of the foreign debt drops.
Right.
But the problem with that is that the reverse is also true. When things go badly, then borrowing foreign debt is very expensive because your currency tends to depreciate.
Right.
And Sri Lanka made a bet that things would go well. It's always a dangerous bet because you can't control what's going to happen. And in fact, what happened in the case of Sri Lanka is a number of things happened, including COVID, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of those things hurt the Sri Lankan economy. And so they were caught in a trap of a weakening economy and rising debt costs. And ultimately, they couldn't pay the debt.
Right. You know, it always occurs to me, sometimes it sounds funny when we think about that, because a lot of so-called LDC or developing countries, they always benefited from great ideas, great advice from people like World Bank, ADB, and all those that are supposed to know how economy works. But in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, did they not know that this kind would be a mistake? How is it that they made that mistake within an environment where great economists keep telling them what to do? So what went wrong?
Yeah, you know, we don't know. We have so many discussions about what succeeds and what fails. But what I've noticed in my many years working with developing countries is that when things are going well, there is this tremendous optimism domestically in which policymakers are saying, things are going well because I'm doing a good job. And I will continue to do a good job, so things will continue to go well. And so they put on structures that assume that things will continue to go well. But you can't really control your environment, particularly if you're a small economy. And when things go badly, then they get very, very badly hurt. So there was a time when Sri Lanka was growing very rapidly. And I think maybe the assumption was, this is not going to change.
Like party goes on forever.
Yeah, the party will go on forever, so keep drinking. The problem is that if you drink too much, you have a hangover.
That's right. Now, Michael, you also mentioned the fact that it's okay to run deficit as long as the money that you have, you use it for productive, so-called productive investment. So can you tell us maybe one or two examples about what a productive investment would be and what a bad, non-productive investment would be?
Yeah. Well, technically, any investment that creates economic value greater than the cost of the investment is good for the economy. Even if the investor loses money, the overall economy can still benefit. So for example, when you build a highway, you don't make a lot of money off the highway, but the economy grows and so everyone benefits. So the question is for a country like Cambodia is, what are the constraints to your growth? One constraint could be that the agricultural sector needs better transportation, more efficient transportation, higher quality support, maybe better irrigation. In that case, investments that do those things end up increasing the total value of productivity. It could also be you need better roads, you need more factories. Any of those things that generate more return than they cost are productive.
Right.
The problem is that people confuse investment in infrastructure as a source of growth. People say if you need to grow, build more roads. And that's incorrect. Infrastructure is a cost of growth.
Right.
You don't build roads because you want to grow. You build roads because they will allow workers to become more productive, and the increase in productivity will be greater than the cost of the road. Unfortunately, though, when you've been growing for many years and building necessary investment, you start to think that investment itself causes the growth. And that's what happened in China or in Japan in the 1980s or in Brazil in the 1970s. After a while, you kept building just to generate economic activity. And you started building things you didn't need.
Right.
Too many bridges, too many highways, too good of a rail service. And when that happens, the cost of your investment is greater than the economic benefits derived from that investment. And then inevitably it's not sustainable and you start to lose.
Right. Professor, I know that you also had a ton of experience when it comes to Latin America, right? Brazil,
Yes.
Argentina, Venezuela. Now, just out of interest, what do you think about Argentina dropping their own currency and just adopting US dollars?
Well, it's a bad idea not to have your own currency. Not everyone agrees, but in the old days, we didn't have currencies. We had the gold standard and the silver standard. And the problem with that is that it makes adjustment very, very difficult, and particularly difficult for the poor, for workers. So beginning in the 30s, we dropped specie standards, gold standards, silver standards, and between the 30s and the 70s, basically every country dropped it. And the argument is that by having your own currency, you can expand and contract your money supply based on your domestic needs. So should Argentina have its own currency? Yes, of course it should. Should it adopt the dollar? No, except that in some cases, the credibility of the currency is so weak, it's been so badly managed that so in the case of Argentina, we had inflation of thousands of % a year, because they just created money to spend because the government couldn't control its spending. In that case, they adopted the dollar not because it's the best system, but because it's the least bad system. Having the peso is so bad that they said, well, let's tie our hands together and give up control of our currency and we'll adopt the dollar. So it's only a solution you use if you cannot control your own currency.
Right, because as you are aware, there's been talk in town, in my town, that we try to de-dollarize our economy. As you know, that our economy is so much dollarized. You can you've been here for some time. You can use dollars everywhere. Now, is that a fair shot to say that de-dollarization would be good for us?
I think it depends on the credibility, and I would say that given Cambodia's recent history, the political instability, the poverty, it's difficult to have a credible currency. What will probably happen is that as Cambodia continues to grow and the role of the government and the credibility of the government strengthens, Cambodia will eventually shift towards a pegged currency and then towards a free currency. But that takes time, and it's not a surprise that many small economies don't have their own currencies because of the credibility issue.
Right. Now, going back to global institutions, World Bank, all that sort, they would be upset if we said free trade in terms of free capital is no good. Because they will come and tell us, no, you have to freely open everything, capital can flow in at any time. But it seems to me that after reading some of your work, your books, you seem to be more cautious. Obviously, you don't object to free capital, but there must be some limits placed on it. As in the case of China, it's not always easy to take money out of China, for example. So if that be the case, then would you, if you were asked by any government to be the advisor, what advice would you give them? Is it better to continue, free flowing capital in and out like that, or would it be better to have some sort of limits somehow?
No, I think it's a mistake. In theory, you want a free flow of capital because capital moves towards its most productive use. In that world, an investor in the United States or in Europe or in Japan would look at Cambodia and say, I can invest money at home and earn 4%, or I could invest in Cambodia, build a factory in Cambodia and earn 6%. So I will take my money and move it to Cambodia. In that case, great, everyone benefits. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where you have huge pools of capital that flow from place to place based on currency appreciation expectations, based on speculation, based on reserve accumulation, based on laundering drug money. And that money doesn't move from country to country in order to seek the most efficient investment.
Right.
It moves for lots of other reasons. And the problem is that when money moves from country to country, the economy has to adjust. And this is particularly a problem for small countries, because a small amount of money coming into Cambodia would be, for the Cambodian financial system, a huge amount of money. One large investment fund in the US or Europe could totally swamp the Cambodian economy. And you don't want that. Obviously, you want stability.
Right.
So I would say that that countries should be very careful about how they control the inflow and outflow of capital. Now, I think if you go to the World Bank and the IMF, more and more economists agree. Where I'm different is that I would argue that even economies like the United States, Europe, Japan should have some degree of capital controls. And I would say that this may seem like a surprising thing to say, but it's actually quite an old thing. If you go back to the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, John Maynard Keynes, who represented England, and Harry Dexter White, who represented the United States, disagreed on many things, but they both agreed that it made no sense to allow the unfettered flow of capital around the world, because the world had to constantly adjust to speculative capital flows, and it always adjusted in a bad way.
Now, let's shift our attention a little bit to where you come from, the US, right? Because we all know that the US runs huge amount of deficit, but how about people thinking? Are they happy? Because in a way, you import a lot, meaning you buy a lot from us from many places, right? So you import a lot, you export much less, so that you have great imbalance. But people, don't they think, that's not too bad. We export a little, and yet we can get a lot of stuff back in our country.
Right.
Isn't that a good idea?
Well, most economists would say that's a good thing. It raises the standard of living of Americans. Most Americans, most workers, most business people, including most policymakers, would say no. And it's an example of where economists understand economics less than ordinary people do. Because the economists believe that the US runs a deficit because the world trades according to comparative advantage, and that the US has a comparative advantage in producing dollars. Now, if you understand comparative advantage, you would understand that that's a totally nonsensical statement. In a world of comparative advantage, you export in order to import, and you pay for your imports by exporting. But the US has a very special role in the global economy, not just the US, but all the Anglophone economies, the US, England, Canada, and Australia. The US is just by far the biggest. And they act as an absorber of excess savings in the rest of the world. So if a country like Germany puts into place policies that force up savings, reduce consumption, and require large trade surpluses, those surpluses have to go somewhere. And the US is the only economy big enough and flexible enough to absorb those surpluses by running deficits. Is that good for the US? No, because US demand is going to support production abroad. US production, in order for it to absorb unemployment in the US must increase its debt, either household debt or fiscal debt. So it's not a coincidence that ever since the US started running huge deficits in the 1980s, it also started seeing huge increases in household and fiscal debt. And that will continue as long as the US runs these large deficits.
Now, if you could quickly explain to us in a very easy terms, is there any notable difference between the bubble in China and the subprime mortgage in the US? Or are they the same?
Well, a real estate bubble tends to look a lot like a real estate bubble. I spoke to a friend of mine, a professor at Princeton University, and we were talking about this, and I told him as a joke that the first really well-recorded real estate bubble in history occurred in Rome in, I believe it was 33 AD, so 2,000 years ago. And yet when you read about that bubble, it is so similar to other bubbles that I said what you could do as a test for your students is write up the Roman bubble, but remove all the names and all the dates,
Right.
and ask them which real estate bubble was this. And he laughed and he said, I've already done that. And he said, most students think it's the Japanese bubble of the 1980s, and some students think it's the US bubble of the 2000s. And in fact, it's the Roman bubble of 2,000 years ago. So they all look very similar. They tend to occur the same way. They tend to get resolved the same way. So in that sense, the Chinese bubble looks a lot like the US bubble. But the way the bubble impacts the economy depends really on the various economic and financial institutions that drive the economy. And in China, they're very different from the US.
Right. Now, I think I wish I could ask you 1,000 more questions, but I know that we are always pressured with time. Now, maybe one or two last questions. We all know that the US, being the number one biggest economic force in the world, and yet we also know that you owe a lot to China, right? So China owns so much. I don't know how much, trillion worth of dollar in terms of your treasury bonds, right? So in a way, does it really concern the US, the fact that yes, you owe money to some country, but it is in your currency. So it means like, this is my dollar, so I'm owing to my own dollar. So should I be worried? Or maybe if you could also take us through what is now known as the MMT, modern money theory. So can you justify whether that's a good idea or that's bad, and if not, why?
Well, the way that question is asked is, does China have any hold over the US by the fact that it lends so much money to the US?
Right.
What would happen if China decided to stop lending to the US? In fact, that question turns out to be meaningless. A lot of people ask it.
Right.
And a lot of people believe that China has the ability to stop lending to the US. But that's not true. China doesn't lend to the US.
Right.
China runs a trade surplus because domestic demand is very weak. When you run a trade surplus, you are exporting, but you're not importing. So you need to get paid for that difference, and you get paid in the form of foreign assets. Right. So the Chinese have to decide which kind of foreign assets do they want. They could lend to developing countries, but that's very risky. They did that, and since 2015-16, their lending to developing countries has gone down. Or they could lend to rich countries, but many of the rich countries, Japan, Europe, are themselves running surpluses, so they're also lending. So at the end of the day, they have to lend to the US or buy US assets.
The treasury bonds, etc.
Yeah, they don't have a choice. Now, well, they have a choice. They could stop. But if they stopped exporting capital, then by the same token, they would stop running surpluses, because the two are, one is the flip side of the other. So the only way they could really stop lending to the US is if they decided to cause exports to collapse. But that would cause unemployment to surge in China, which of course they don't want. So for them, acquiring US assets is the flip side of avoiding unemployment.
At the whole country.
If you want one, you have to have the other. If you don't want one, you don't get the other.
Wow, it's very, very mind-boggling to think about it, right? But okay, as I said, but maybe now come to our conclusion. With your tons of experience everywhere, I know that you started off your career as a trader. You did a lot of trade finance and all that before you became an academic, and you've been advising governments in every continent, I believe. But in the future, where do you want to see yourself at? So you want to be still teaching, or you want to, be an advisor of somewhere, someplace? And if you were able to pick between different continents, where would you like to be and why?
Well, I really enjoy. I love New York. That's my city. It's hard for me to believe that I'm not living there, but I love living in Asia, particularly in China. It's a very interesting place. I grew up in many different countries, in Spain and Pakistan, Peru, so I'm pretty comfortable in most places. For me, I'm just very lucky. I get to do things that I think are quite exciting, and as long as they're exciting things to do, I'll go wherever that happens. Maybe one day I'll move to Cambodia.
Please.
It seems like a very, very interesting economy.
Well, great pleasure as always. Thank you very much, Professor Michael
Thank
Pettis.
you very much.
Your expertise will continue to shed light on our minds, right? So please keep writing, please keep speaking to the furthest extent possible, so that we, my students, and everyone who's listening to this can keep enjoying hearing your wisdom and try to make sense of the world, right? Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong, but so be it. At the end of the day, we'll be happy knowing that whatever we say has changed some minds for the better of it. So again, thank you very much, and hope we will do this again soon.
And thank you for inviting me to spend a month in Cambodia. This has been great.
That's right. So it's an honor for us, CamEd Business School. All right, everybody, thank you very much. Until then, see you next time. Bye-bye.